everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, it's me, Jackie.
Hey, it's Diana.
Wow, I mean, I love that we've got a podcast coming up. It hasn't started yet. It's about to start recording, but I don't know. I'm starting to feel a little nervous, starting to freeze. Then I'm starting to engage in all sorts of other, activated behavior. I'm starting to move my hands and get upset and talk really fast and get loud.
That's just your normal life.
You're always loud.
This is my normal life? Oh, okay, so that's just my normal baseline?
But you know what? My armpits are sweaty.
Uh-oh, your armpits are sweaty.
Yeah.
Are they always sweaty, or is this a new thing because it's about to be a podcast?
This is a new thing.
So many years of podcasting. It's not podcast yet.
It's about to be podcast.
But it's about to be podcast. We're all getting very nervous, which might mean that the topic this week on our podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research is anxiety and its treatment. But I don't know about you, but I'm all a little bit nervous. I don't know if I'm ready to go on. So thank goodness we have a guest who can lead us through this, to be our spirit guide, in a way, metaphorically speaking. Dr. Keira Moore. Keira, help us. Help us. We're all having anxiety, podcast anxiety, and we
Welcome
need
to the show.
Your help. Welcome to the show.
Now you made me anxious.
Oh no! It's a positive feedback loop. We're in trouble.
Oh,
Keira, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on. That was all an act, folks. We've been doing this for so many years. No anxiety around podcasts. We're all
I'm
excited.
legitimately a little bit anxious.
Really? Okay, well, don't worry.
It's mostly Jackie.
Oh, Jackie's an SD.
I'm not going to
scaredy
no.
cat behavior.
She's saying that because she's been part of my thesis defenses. And in thesis defenses,
You mean the other way around?
She's been on the faculty committee of thesis defenses that I have been the person questioning people. Is that what I mean?
Okay.
And for sometimes I go for it.
Sometimes Jackie is an aversive stimulus.
As all
Not for me.
all the students are like, I don't want her on my committee.
Don't worry, Keira.
I won't do that. I
nice
promise.
enough to come on our show. It's all
Right,
softballs from here on out. Don't you worry. Got the questions ahead of time and everything. You don't have to worry about that. The last thing we want is more anxiety on our podcast about like treatment for anxiety and specifically anxiety in autism, because that's what we will be talking about tonight. And that is an area that you wrote your dissertation on the treatment of. And we haven't talked about anxiety on the show in forever. What was it? Like episode 40 something or 50 maybe?
I'm actually not sure. I think
it was
you
a
stumped me
long
on that
time
one, Rob.
ago.
Ooh, this is the first time that Diana's ever been stumped.
Nobody
episode
listens to
number.
that episode. So luckily we've got Keira this time. So now they'll listen.
I'm going to tell you. It's 43.
43.
Yeah.
Wow.
I knew that.
A long time ago. So I hope anxiety treatment, it's come a ways since then, because that would have been years ago now. So we are very excited to talk not just about some kind of updates on anxiety treatment, but specifically anxiety in autism with you, Keira. So before we do that, I'm getting anxious just hearing myself talk more. Diana, switch. What are the articles we will be discussing tonight?
Okay. I can tell you what those are. We're going to talk about 2 articles tonight. The first one is titled Assessing and Treating Anxiety in Individuals with Autism, and that is by our special guest, Dr. Moore, Bullard, Sweetman, and Ahearn, published in Behavior Modification 2021. And then as a supplemental article to that, which I suspect we'll be discussing the most, we also have a case study of behavioral assessment and treatment of insect phobia by Jones and Friman, published in JABA 1999.
The late 90s appeared to be the moment where there was some anxiety discussion in behavior analytic journals, and then it's sort of not a lot since then, it seems.
There was a lot going on then. There's a lot of anxiety in the world. Y2K was coming up.
Oh, geez. I was thinking September 11th, but we didn't know that one was coming. We couldn't have anxiety about it.
That's true.
We should make sure Keira gets to talk about herself.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, okay. I thought you jumped right over that.
I was
one.
pretending to have anxiety, Dad. I actually do remember how to start our podcast.
All right, fair enough.
So anyway, Keira, why don't you tell us all about yourself? Totally unprompted, I asked.
Let's see. I have been a behavior analyst for a very long time now. Every time I try and figure out how many years, it just makes me feel sad about how old I am.
Same.
But I started way back when at the New England Center for Children with, I think all of you were there at the time when I started.
I started before you started.
Jackie was there.
How old I am.
Yeah, Jackie was there when I was an intern, I think.
Yep, that's disgusting.
A very long time ago. But I got my master's degree and my PhD while I was working there. And I worked for the Shriver Center doing some research for a little while. And then I went to a different program and opened up a home service program. And then I took a little hiatus from behavior analysis and traveled all over the world as a flying trapeze instructor and performer. And then I finally decided. Sounds like you
made it up, by the way. But it's true, she did that.
I did that, and then I decided I need to actually have a real job again. And now I have kind of switched gears a little bit, and I teach for Regis College, which is pretty amazing. And I run my own consulting company on sleep problems and severe behavior problems. And I do all kinds of other random behavior analytic type things that are not normal 9-to-5 clinical jobs. So it's been really exciting for me to kind of branch out and try some different things.
Keira, I'd heard the story about the behavior analyst who went around the world teaching the flying trapeze. I did not put it together that was you. I had heard that before. The mythical story.
That is a true story that I up and walked. I took what was supposed to be a 3-month leave of absence from my job to go pursue my hobby at the time of flying trapeze. And I started doing that full time. And then I called my boss about a month later and he said, I already know what you're going to say. You're not coming back, are you? And I was like, I'm having a lot of fun doing this. And I have opportunities to travel and they were incredible and let me off the hook. And we had a great person to replace me at that job, and I traveled all over the world for a while doing that before I kind of landed in warmer weather in California.
And she has super abs, just so everyone knows.
You need them for the trapeze.
I have to. Yeah. You got me hanging upside down a lot.
That's the one thing. That's the one reason I don't do trapeze, Keira. It's my abs just aren't up to. That's the only one. Otherwise, I'd be up there. But
That's all you need.
Well, Keira, so coming back to anxiety specifically, the article that you wrote with Bill, that was your dissertation. So that you'd done that work a while back, or this was an updated?
I started that in 2010 or 2011, I think, is when I started working on that for my dissertation. It just took me a very long time to sit down and get that publication done. I think sometimes people don't realize with doc research in particular that the papers that we write for our programs are absurdly long and not usually in publication form. So taking it from your dissertation to a publishable manuscript can be a monumental task. And I was a little burnt out after working on that project for a while. So I kind of put it aside while I was traveling and doing some other things. And then after a lot of nagging from Bill, finally got back to getting that ready for publication so that he would finally leave me alone.
Oh, good. Well, I think it's great that it's finally out there in publication. Because as I put in the notes or in the questions, there's something about discussing anxiety as behavior that can be observed rather than as this mental construct that it's in you. If only you could get that anxiety out. That, the way you describe it just feels very like an aha moment, like, oh yeah, no, that's it. Like it in itself just feels like a very kind of simple, elegant solution. Like, yes, that is one track that one could take on studying anxiety more directly rather than only using verbal report, which we'll talk about has some limitations depending on your client and the individual who's, dealing with the anxiety. Full disclosure, everyone out there, I did put some of these questions in the notes to Keira, that there are just some things I want to brainstorm and sort of riff a little bit by the end, which you don't have to have answers for, but relating to when is it anxiety that we're talking about versus simple escape avoidance maintained behavior. But I guess we probably should spend some time now just talking about what is anxiety, because it is a term that many of us probably use daily, that have heard daily, and I think in many ways do short shrift to individuals who are suffering from, the DSM-5 definition of anxiety, or whether generalized anxiety or, phobia or specified anxiety around certain triggers in the environment. So, Keira, would you mind kind of walking us through, your definition of anxiety, sort of how you came to that definition of anxiety to be used in your paper?
Yeah, so it's a hard one, and that was kind of the hardest starting point, was figuring out how do we actually talk about anxiety as behavior analysts? Is it even something that we can be talking about as behavior analysts? And the kind of traditional conceptualization of anxiety, I think both for just your everyday general population and for most of psychology, is that anxiety is something people have that causes behavior. And it's kind of like this invisible, evil little monster that lives inside of you, in your brain or in your body or in your mind or whatever, depending on who you talk to, how they conceptualize that. And it makes you act or feel a certain way. So that's kind of how most people think of anxiety. It's this thing in you that causes behavior. But that, of course, doesn't really work for us as behavior analysts, because we don't think about behavior that way. We think about environment and behavior and how do those two play together, and kind of having this intervening variable of anxiety as this mysterious thing in you that's kind of driving your behavior doesn't really get us anywhere. So the definition that we use in this study and in this paper is that anxiety is a cluster of responses. It can be both operant and respondent behavior. Sometimes it's both. Sometimes it's one or the other. I would say more often than not, it has a little bit of both. Mm-hmm. And it can include public and or private behavior. Again, it can be one, it can be both. Usually it's a little bit of both. And then that cluster of responses reliably changes, either increasing or decreasing, or again, you might have a little bit of both in a specific context. And that specific context is when you have an upcoming aversive stimulus that's being signaled. So it's not there yet, but something in your environment's telling you this bad thing is going to happen. So that's kind of a big, not easy definition. Mm-hmm. But I always tell people the kind of easiest way to think about that in kind of shorthand is it's a change in behavior that happens when something bad is signaled. It's the most succinct way to put it, I think.
So when we're talking about like an example, Keira, something like for anxiety, I kind of would consider myself having anxiety of flying. I don't like flying. It makes me uncomfortable. I have a definite change in behavior. It's a lot of private events. I have some physiological, so like respondent, flushing, when the plane is moving or bumping up and down. Now, for me to just be like, everything's great, and I'm just on my baseline resting state, and then I sit on a plane, and then I feel like I'm going to throw up, and I start thinking I'm going to die on this plane. I hate this plane. I need to get out of this plane. Would that be anxiety? Or would that just be a natural reaction to some sort of aversive change in my environment? Because I think that's really where I know a lot of people get caught up on using anxiety. So any bad feeling or bad or negative talk in private events is anxiety. How does one parse that out? I mean, is there like a temporal limit that we should be looking for?
I think it's a hard one. It has a lot of gray area, I think, because we're talking about behavior that we're defining based on an environmental context. So it turns into this kind of circular definition in some ways. One thing to differentiate is anxiety versus fear. So anxiety is when you are having some behavioral change in response to a stimulus that signals something bad happening, mm-hmm. versus fear is in the presence of that actual aversive stimulus. Mm-hmm. So that's one place where we're talking about sitting on an airplane that we might have to dig a little further to say, okay, is this an anxiety situation or is this fear because the aversive stimulus is being on the airplane? But I would guess the aversive stimulus there probably isn't the actual being on the airplane. It's the potential for something bad to happen on that airplane, right? Like the potential for the airplane to crash, or the potential for, I don't know, whatever your worst case scenario is on an airplane.
Okay.
So in
Mine
that
is sitting
case,
next to someone and having them fall asleep on my shoulder.
oh yeah.
So it would be potentially anxiety if someone were sitting next to you and they were like, I'm wide awake, my eyes are open, and I'm drinking 50 cups of coffee, and you still were getting cold sweats. That would be more likely anxiety than fear, because clearly the person is not signaling like, oh, I'm about to fall asleep, I'm going to go this way.
I think mine would be surviving the plane crash and then slowly dying on the desert island because I don't know how to survive.
Oh.
Or eating everyone.
Yeah, or having to eat my
That might be the fun part,
passengers.
eating all the passengers.
Yeah, so if your fear is something about being on the airplane, like that you don't like being confined in a small space, or you don't like, I hate the smell of airplanes, like the recycled people's fart air. That's like the worst part about being on an airplane for me.
What are you talking about? That's the best part.
So it depends what the aversive stimulus is, and if it's something that's being signaled that it might happen or that it's about to happen. So you had mentioned, like, if you hit turbulence and the plane kind of bounces, that really will escalate all this anxiety that you're having, which makes sense if the aversive stimulus is the plane crashing or there being some kind of emergency. So it kind of depends on the context. It is, I think anxiety is a really tricky thing to define. And then of course there's generalized anxiety too, which is a whole different ball of wax, because that is when you don't even know what the aversive stimulus is anymore. It's basically a whole bunch of different stimuli in your environment come to be signals for aversive events. So you're just constantly being in contact with signals for something bad happening.
But a key component of anxiety, Keira, would you say, is that you are having whatever this change to your baseline is not directly in the presence of the stimulus? You know, like if a wolf jumps out at me and I scream, no, I'd be like, looks like Robin is wolf anxiety acting up again. Like, no, I've literally, like, the thing's jumping at me. I'm allowed to scream and yell and cry and all. Like, that's a fair response to that event. Like that would be a starting point, maybe.
Yeah, I think in that case, when the aversive event's actually there and present, then we call that fear.
Okay.
And in that case, that's likely a respondent reaction, right? If danger pops into your face, you go into fight or flight mode.
Okay. So when we look at sort of the classical treatment plan for someone who has been diagnosed or is saying, I have anxiety, it typically revolves a lot of verbal reporting. I have anxiety. Tell me about your anxiety. Well, it happens when these events occur, or it happens all the time, or I'm really nervous about something that could happen but may not happen on a regular basis. Correct? It's a lot of verbal reports.
A lot of verbal report in terms of measuring it. Yeah, that's mostly how we measure anxiety, is by asking people how they're feeling and by using questionnaires. And then in the case of people like children on the autism spectrum where we can't ask them directly, we rely on parent report.
I'm assuming that was sort of one of the kind of kernels of why you wanted to work on your dissertation, is the idea of, well, that doesn't feel like as direct a measure as we would strive for. Correct?
Yeah,
or was there another?
We don't in behavior analysis, we don't like to rely on just indirect measures, right? Like with things like problem behavior, you don't want to just rely on doing a fast or doing a mass. You want to actually see the behavior and measure the behavior and manipulate the behavior and know what's going on. And anxiety, just like any other problem behavior, deserves that same treatment. And I think it's a bit hard sometimes. I'm sure everybody who works or has worked with people with autism have worked with people who have this kind of hard to put your finger on, but they seem uncomfortable or they seem anxious or they seem stressed out all the time. But it's hard to measure that or hard to quantify that.
It's not that any of us here are saying anxiety is not real. It's just hard to measure. It's one of those public-private distinction challenges. And, verbal report can be part of the solution, but verbal report is not always reliable. And if someone has limited vocal verbal ability, then we have less to go on in that capacity.
Mm-hmm.
But there may be other indicators, like you're saying, Keira, of ways we could determine if someone's anxious when we're looking to add to that distinction.
Keira, I'd love to hear more about, this directly was related to your research, but more about those direct measures. You know, what are the signs that one might say, I see it, I see your anxiety, that either existed in the literature prior to your research or that you kind of had to put together for your research? Because I don't think I'd read anything quite like your paper before.
It's an interesting thing because anywhere you look in the anxiety literature, it's almost all that verbal report. And then occasionally when there are direct measures of behavior, it's usually an approach or avoidance measure, which kind of makes sense for like phobia-based things. So a lot of anxiety research is phobia-based, and it's basically measuring how close can we get this person to get to this thing that they're afraid of. And that's the one direct measure that you see a lot of the time. The first study that I know of, there may have been some before, but the first one that I know of where anxiety was measured directly as behavior was the Estes and Skinner paper in 1941, I believe, where they basically had rats in a Skinner box and they're pressing a lever on a, I think, fixed time schedule. So they're pressing pretty regularly. And they started introducing them to a long tone that was followed by a shock. And they'd measure. Horrible. Yeah. I, as somebody who's actually done research with rats in a Skinner box, my rat had a name, and I would carry him around in my pocket. He was great. His name was Ralphie.
Mine was Walter.
Oh. But Skinner and Estes, what they did was they repeatedly paired this long tone with a shock. And the whole time the rats can still press that lever. They can still earn the food. That is totally independent of the shock. And they found that after a couple pairings of that long tone and shock, that during the tone, the rats would stop pressing the lever or they would slow down.
Right.
And the lever press had nothing to do with the tone or the shock. There was nothing that the rat could do to avoid the tone or the shock. But that tone came to elicit or evoke some anxiety. And the way that they measured that anxiety was the rate of lever pressing. And they said, okay, that's anxiety. That's conditioned suppression. So that's basically this ongoing state of behavior kind of drops down during this signal that something bad's about to happen. So that's like, I think, a really cool way to measure anxiety. But nobody really followed that up very well with human work and applying that to humans. The next known study that did something similar that I know of was the Jones and Brymen study, which is a similar idea of what they did there.
Yeah, I was going to say while you were describing the Skinner and Estes study of, that sounds like the one you said. It's one of your favorites, is that which we'll be talking about today, Jones and Friman. So Jones and Friman were working with Mike, their buddy Mike, on an insect phobia. What I thought was so strange, and I don't know if I ever would have thought this is the measure for anxiety, was his performance on math questions.
Mm-hmm.
When you put it in context of thinking about response suppression, it does make sense.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. But can you imagine describing that to someone outside of the context of like, one way you could measure anxiety would be how well you do on your math test.
It's interesting, though, because that's actually part of, not math in particular, but that's part of the diagnostic criteria for phobia disorders. It actually includes that you have impaired performance in some aspect of your life. But nobody ever uses that as an actual measure. Like, that's actually one really cool way to measure phobias, is how much is it impairing your performance? Because that's part of the criteria. So I don't know why that's not a more common thing to be looking at.
That's a great point, Keira, because I know one of the things that grinds my gears about anxiety is I work in schools, and you'll just get these reports that are like, yep, kids got anxiety, kids got this, kids. And I don't ever want to discount that a child is going through something, that they're struggling with something. But you're looking at, well, how do they come to this diagnosis of anxiety, which now is going to result in like a change in possibly the class they're in or the speed of instruction, all these big changes. And you're looking and they sort of, oh, well, we did some rating scales and we asked mom and dad what they thought. And mom and dad thought this, and the child may or may not have had any input. There's no description of what the child looked like, if any of those stimuli were presented or occurred. It's just, yeah, they say all these things. Therefore, here you go, the anxiety disorder, which again, I don't like to discount that a child might be having some sort of, unfortunate or unpleasant response, but it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as anxiety. It could be a fear response. It could be some sort of a learned behavior. There are a lot of other things that could be going on. And once you have that label, it's like, nope, that's what it is. And no one will ever hear it differently. And it's anxiety. And therefore,
and it's viewed as causal.
And exactly. And then everything has to do with, well, how are we going to solve this anxiety? Because of course they can't do anything until we solve the anxiety.
Yeah, and then for me, where that becomes especially problematic is when we think about anxiety, as people traditionally do, as this sort of driving force inside of you that causes behavior, and we don't have a good way to measure it other than maybe rating scales or asking somebody, which isn't very objective, then A, we don't know if our treatments are working because we don't have an objective baseline or pre-post anything. And B, it leaves us with limited options as far as treatment. If you're conceptualizing anxiety as this kind of invisible beast inside of you controlling your behavior, it really only leaves you with one treatment option, which is medication, which is the go-to treatment option for anxiety. And unfortunately, isn't always a very good thing, doesn't always work. It works great for some people. It doesn't work great for a lot of people. And the long-term research, unfortunately, is starting to point to some not so good effects of being on anxiety medication long-term.
Mm-hmm. So when we go back to Jones and Friman, you mentioned kind of in some of our initial correspondences, this is your favorite anxiety article. What about this is, I always love a Pat Friman article, Pat Friman talk, Pat Friman anything, it's always good. But what specifically about this article kind of ranks it up there for you?
I like the simplicity of it. And I think that's where the kind of genius of that article lies, is in how simple it is. And that was really the kind of thing that set me off on the path that I went on with my dissertation, because I heard Pat reference this study in a talk that he gave, I think at APBA. And I had been thinking about wanting to do something with anxiety and something with repetitive and ritualistic behavior. That was an area that I was really interested in. And I kept getting stuck on this idea of repetitive and ritualistic behavior is related to anxiety, but how do we prove that, or how do we figure that out, and how do we measure that, and what does that even mean? And then I heard Pat talking about this study, and it was like it just hit me right square in the face. And I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. You just measure behavior. It's not actually that hard to figure this out.
So in the study, like we've already mentioned, Mike's performance on math examples or math questions was the dependent measure in various conditions where he was either told, hey, there's a bug in the room somewhere, or there were actually, I love how they counted the bugs and they searched for the bugs. I love those little descriptions.
Not
in the
like
article.
a bug, like a microphone in the
cricket.
flower
crickets?
pot or whatever.
Yeah,
crickets,
they actually
right?
had crickets.
Yeah.
So they had I think they even described how they got the crickets too, which I never expected to read in a behavior analytic journal of like purchasing cricket details, but you got to replicate it somehow, right? I don't know. And just sort of used his performance on, hey, there's crickets right there, or hey, there's a cricket somewhere, but you can't see it, or I promise there's no crickets in this room. And then how many math problems did he get correct became the dependent measure. And just sort of looking at the simple graph, it's a short paper.
3-page paper.
And it just really feels like it captures the idea of, oh, Dr. Friman and Dr. Jones, yeah, this kid is really struggling. It's usually math class, and it's because he's always worried about these crickets. And sometimes kids tease him. And it's like, there we go. Don't say no more. Got my study. I'm all ready to go.
And what a perfect objective way to measure that, because for this kid, the problem for him is that this phobia with bugs is affecting his life because he can't get on with his normal day-to-day activities. And so that's where the anxiety is really problematic. And by measuring that and seeing the difference before treatment and after treatment is really telling, especially because with their treatment, when they initially did just graduated exposure, they got him all the way up to the point that he could hold crickets in his hands during that graduated exposure. But still at that point, when they tested how many math problems can he do in the presence of crickets, he still wasn't as high as he was when there were no crickets in the room. So it showed, even though we might see a treatment like that and go, oh, the kid's holding crickets in his hand, problem solved.
Right.
It actually wasn't solved for him. It took an additional adding in some reinforcement to actually get him to be able to focus on what he was supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
So the brilliance in that study for me, though, is in their assessment. The treatment is nothing incredibly new or exciting. Other people had done similar things, but the way they assessed the anxiety was genius, I think.
Yeah. And I think the other piece there, too, is without the assessment, without the treatment plan, like you said, being run that way, there was not going to be that reinforcement component, meaning, yeah, you mastered treatment did not improve your actual behavior in the environment that we were testing. And I know certainly I've suggested, like, well, we could use some reinforcement systems. And one of the things I'll get as pushback a lot when there's an anxiety diagnosis on the table is you can't use reinforcement. It's the anxiety. It's going to make it impossible for reinforcement to work. And again, that certainly could be. But it's nice to see a study like this, even if it had been, no, just using the graduated exposure was effective. At least there was a way to demonstrate, yes, using this treatment, we saw the effect we wanted. Or no, using this treatment, we didn't. We added a component and then we saw that feature. Because I think when we talk about reinforcement systems, I think when we're talking about anything having to do with, the mind or the little anxiety critter, people do become very dismissive of behavioral technologies. It's like, no, that doesn't work. That's not going to work because it doesn't affect your brain or how your brain is processing things. Like they know which neurons are the anxiety neurons up there, but everyone's an expert when it comes to
I think people get overly focused on the respondent part, and typically the respondent part is not actually what's interfering with people's lives. And once we fix the operant part, the respondent stuff kind of comes along for the ride with it a lot of the time. So it's a weird, like, you can't be overly focused on either end, I think. But typically when people are complaining about anxiety being interfering, the things they're actually complaining about are the operant behavior things and the way it's actually affecting their life.
Mm-hmm. Question on sort of how you sort of conceptualized Mike's insect phobia. So, phobia being a form of anxiety, I guess we could say. In terms of his responding, when he was told there are bugs in the room but could not see the bugs, after at least I think it was one session where he did sort of have a drop in responding. After that, though, his responding was about the same as being told there are no bugs in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Would this be a case in which his insect phobia therefore wouldn't qualify, and qualify might not be the right word, but might not be described as anxiety because, no, he had a problem when there were bugs in the room? Or would it still possibly be anxiety because we're not really getting at, what is it about the bugs? Like, they don't do anything. Is it they're going to jump on you and they're not on you, therefore it's anxiety because their presence signals that they could jump on you?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a question that's sort of not worth splitting hairs about? What do you think?
Yeah, I remember I had asked Pat about that and said, wouldn't that be fear and not anxiety? And he kind of he had some thoughts on that, and I don't recall what the details of what he said were, but he basically was like, it doesn't matter. It's kind of splitting hairs at that point.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would depend again on what's the actual aversive stimulus, which you would have to, I guess, know from asking the participant. Is it just seeing the bugs? Is like the sight of the bugs aversive, or is it something about like that they might jump on you or they might bite you or they might hit you in the face?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I would bet for most people that don't like bugs, if you see a bug on TV, that doesn't cause anxiety or cause any kind of fear. But if you see that same bug right next to you, it's going to be a totally different response, right?
Mm-hmm. That bug could jump in your mouth while you're sleeping.
Yeah.
I just put that in everyone's head.
I've heard people say before, like, if you encounter a bear, it's not the bear itself that you're afraid of. It's the bear mauling you and killing you that you're afraid of. So it's not the bear that's aversive. It's the possibilities of what the bear might do that are aversive.
But depending on what kind of bear, like grizzly bears, they're jerks. If you see a grizzly bear, it's going to rip you apart like all the time. They're super mean bears. So
I spent a long time researching how to know the difference between different kinds of bears. Even though I live in California where there aren't really bears where I live, I need to worry about like snakes and cougars and things like that. But
there used to be bears before the gold rush.
Yeah, that's true. Well, it's on our state flag.
That's right. I was going to say that.
The gold rush killed all those grizzly bears off.
Did?
I just learned about it.
They just didn't want to be a part of the gold rush? They didn't have the right tools, so they left?
Bears hate gold.
Killed them immediately because they would try to eat them to death and or eat their food.
I hate when things eat me to death. It's the worst.
Arguably, it'd be worse to be eaten not to death.
Yes.
Ooh, yeah. Right. Like half-eaten.
Yeah,
you just gotta sit there.
Really good point.
Then I feel like we're splitting hairs
really,
like with anxiety about like, did I die because I was eaten or because I got an infection from the open wound that was sort of there?
Anyway.
So like if I can't go on picnics because I have bear anxiety because they're going to steal my picnic basket, that's anxiety though, because most bears will just eat you, not your picnic basket.
Or if you're
it depends on what's easiest.
Right.
I guess.
And if you're on a picnic and you just keep talking about the bears that might come, right? Mm-hmm. The whole time you're at the picnic and being like, there might be a bear behind that tree. Maybe there's a bear. I wonder if there's a bear.
It ruins your picnic.
Yeah. And
that's my favorite kind of anxiety.
Right? Mm-hmm. The behavior that you can measure. We can talk about how many times you said the word bear in half hour.
Or you could get a baseline of how much does a person typically talk at a meal inside versus at a picnic. You could compare the two.
Where bears are.
I call that behavior verbal diarrhea. And that is my favorite measure of anxiety because that is probably the best measure of anxiety for me. That is like a direct measure for me. If I'm talking a lot, I'm probably nervous about something.
Ooh.
Oh, okay.
Now I know.
It's for me, I'm constantly talking, so it's the opposite. If I stop talking, something terrible must be going on.
Conditioned suppression.
There you go.
All right. So before we move on to your study, Keira, do you have any other favorite anxiety studies beyond Jones and Friman? Because I know you cited a number of them, and I think we talked about almost all of them on the show. Like, I literally, there might be one article after we talk about yours in the behavior analysis literature on anxiety that we have not already discussed on the show, which there are not that many topics that I think we could say, we did it, everybody. We talked about them all.
There are quite a few, but they are mostly not geared toward autism, or they are not direct measures of anxiety. But Friman, Hayes, and Wilson have a 1998 paper that's an awesome conceptual paper about anxiety. Another favorite is Woods and Miltenberger, 1996. They have a paper about nervous habits where it's super simple. It's like another 3-pager. And they basically just had, I think it was a bunch of college students, and they brought them into a room where they were secretly recording them and they didn't tell them.
Creepy.
And they had 3 different conditions. One was that they were bored, so they just had to sit in an empty room for 12 minutes, I think. One was that they were anxious, which this is the best one, because what they would do is they'd bring them to this room and they'd give them a paper to read, and they'd say, in 10 minutes, you have to give a presentation on this paper in front of a group of peers. And then they'd be like, okay, bye, and leave the room and leave them with this paper. And then they had another one that was a neutral condition where they just put like a boring TV show on. And basically what they did was just watch people during these different conditions, and they would measure all kinds of different behavior that was kind of arbitrarily decided. And they found that in the anxious condition, people tended to manipulate their hair and their face a lot more than any other conditions. So like touching their face and like doing like twirling their hair and playing with their hair. And they found in the bored condition, people tended to manipulate objects a lot. So they'd like be spinning a pencil or like tapping on stuff or like doing things with objects. So just a cool paper to show that like you could actually, that's one way to measure what do people do when they're nervous.
Mm-hmm. I love that idea because I know I've had people tell me when discussing anxiety, like I saw someone, they were tapping their foot a lot. That's a sign of anxiety. And it's really hard to be like, no, that's not a sign of anxiety because again, it's going to be very specific to the individual. You would have to actually set up a situation which was they've reported or that you've seen that pattern of behavior happen, and then times you haven't seen it happen, and then compare the rates between the two to really definitively say that.
And that's kind of how I went in the direction I went with my dissertation, because we see kids with autism engaging in repetitive and ritualistic behavior all the time, right? That's part of the diagnostic criteria. But a lot of repetitive and ritualistic behavior tends to look like OCD. And OCD falls under the category of anxiety diagnoses. So I think as a result of that kind of topographical similarity in OCD and repetitive and ritualistic behavior, people see kids with autism engage in repetitive and ritualistic behavior and immediately jump to the conclusion that that kid has anxiety, that kid is anxious, that's why they're engaging in that behavior. Mm-hmm. And what we found with some kids is it's actually the opposite of that. A lot of kids with autism, and probably adults as well, engage in repetitive and ritualistic behavior or stereotypical behavior because it feels good. It feels nice. It has nothing to do with anxiety. It's not OCD. It just feels good, or they enjoy doing it. Some kids line things up because they like to, because that brings them enjoyment.
So it's not automatic negative reinforcement.
Yeah, so you can't jump to the conclusion if you see a kid with autism that does a thing like they have to tap a door 3 times before they walk out of a room, you shouldn't just jump to the conclusion that they're anxious or they're stressed out or that's OCD or that's anxiety. They might just like doing that, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, Keira, I can't wait to talk more about this. But before we do, we need to take a little break. Don't be anxious, audience. We promise we will be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking with Dr. Keira Moore about anxiety and autism and anxiety treatment. See, I hope you didn't feel nervous. There was no operant responding condition, responding, because we came right back just like we promised with the song and everything like that. You probably are also a little nervous. Are we going to do the code words? Yes, of course, we're going to do the secret code words. Because as many of you may know, ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. And by listening to the show, you can earn 1 learning credit. All you need to do is finish listening to the show, then go to the website, abainsidetrack.com/getceus, that's GET-CEUS, and enter into secret code words. These are secret guest code words this week, and the first of them is trapeze, TRAPEZE. Keira, what other kinds of trapeze are there? Is it just the flying trapeze, or are there other kinds?
Oh, there's other kinds. There's the flying trapeze. That's where there's like the 2 people in the air and one flies across, the other one catches them. There's static trapeze, which is like 1 bar that hangs still and you perform to music. There's duo static trapeze with 2 people on 1 bar. I used to do that. There's dance trapeze. A lot of trapezes.
Whoa. Okay.
Trapeze? I don't know.
Awesome.
The trapezi. Well, so you don't need to remember all those types of trapeze, listeners, just the word trapeze. All right. So when we went to break here, we just started talking a little bit more in depth about the kind of conceptualization of your study. And I've got to say, this study is, I kind of already said, like, I love the idea of it. I love the setup. I love all the components of it. It just feels very like a eureka kind of moment. But my biggest question in reading this was, how long did it actually take you to do all of these assessments and treatments, because usually when you have participants, you have 5 participants, like, oh, and then everyone did the same thing, but you couldn't do that for anxiety because it wasn't a one size fits all sort of an issue for any of them. So really, how long did it take to just run the assessments and just run the treatments, not even the write it up, which we kind of talked about at the beginning?
Very long time. I think the whole project with data collection was about 5 years because we had a couple of different iterations that we went through with the assessment before we kind of figured out what actually worked. And then we had some participants that didn't get all the way through the assessment for various reasons, and we'd kind of have to start over again as you often do in research. So the whole thing was a good 5 years and then 6 more to write it up.
Oh, wow.
To be fair, I wasn't working on it most of that 6 years.
It was like nonstop 6 years. You've just been staring at the screen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Every now and then I'd pull it up and be like, oh, that's still there on my computer. Oh, okay, X. gotta go do something else.
So, the overall idea was individuals who you identified, or they were identified by their like case managers or members of the team at the school you were working out of, like, I think they have anxiety, or I think they engage in these odd behaviors. What was that like? We
actually started with a massive survey of all of the kids in the school, which was a couple hundred of them, where we would have their case managers fill out just like a brief rating scale about repetitive and ritualistic behavior. So we were specifically looking for kids that engaged in certain types of repetitive and ritualistic behavior. And we kind of pull the files on those ones and then go and talk to their case managers a little bit more about whether they thought those behaviors might have some anxiety component or whether they could identify certain anxiety provoking contexts. And it was, the whole first year of the research was just trying to identify participants.
And when you were looking for anxiety, it was just general questions, right? To the case manager of like, do you think this could be anxiety? Did you have more kind of specific prompts that you used?
Yeah, we would ask specifically about the topographies of repetitive and ritualistic behavior that they had identified, and then say, is there anything in particular that seems to cause this behavior? Do they do it at certain times or in certain contexts? Is there anything that they seem to be anxious about? So we were looking for kids that people could readily identify that engaged in certain behavior in specific contexts. So we were looking for anxiety that would fit sort of neatly into this way that we wanted to measure it. We weren't looking for kids that presented more with like your generalized anxiety of like, no, they're like this all the time and we don't know why.
Mm-hmm. 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 So there had to be times, and that sort of came into the observations that you would then do, of times of everything looks fine. They're showing, kind of qualities of happiness or indices of happiness, and then something occurs and their behavior changes significantly from.
Yeah. Yep. And for most of our kids, we were looking for at least 2 different contexts that had similar responses because we wanted to be able to measure across 2 different tests. So we had to be able to identify kids that not only had this distinct change in behavior, but that people knew when it happened reliably and that there were at least 2 different contexts that it happened in.
And so from those observations, you were able to create kind of individualized assessments for each student. Can you sort of talk about, using details from the, the students and sort of the environments, but how did you go about doing that? Was it as simple as it reads after the fact, or was it something that took like lots of rethinking and repiloting before you kind of hit on the procedure?
Once we kind of figured out how the assessment procedure was going to go, then it got a lot easier to figure out how to plug different kids into that procedure. Initially, there was a lot of different troubleshooting of how to make it work, but once we had an idea of how we wanted the assessment to look, then we better knew what kinds of kids were going to fit into that kind of assessment. So for us, it was something we had to be able to do it in a controlled setting. We had to be able to provide them with some kind of stimulus that was a reliable predictor that the aversive event was going to happen. It had to be an aversive event that wasn't super aversive or dangerous and something that we could recreate over and over again. We were very careful to pick only anxiety-provoking contexts that were things that kids encounter in their regular day. Like we weren't going out of our way to like bring in a scary clown or have a tiger come in from the zoo to try to scare somebody. It was like, these are kids that are struggling in their everyday.
Yeah. That tiger is not going to get past the IRB.
No, definitely not.
But I think that's a really good point, right? Because someone could come back and say, well, why did you go through all of this process if it was something that you could just not introduce the kids to, right? Like, I really, really don't like ketchup. Maybe I have a phobia about ketchup.
You do hate ketchup.
I hate it so much, but I just don't eat it. And then my life's pretty much fine, right? So I think if you had picked something like that, where it was like, well, you could have just avoided it, then that would be a different story than the types of anxiety-provoking, stimuli that are in this study, which are things that basically the students could not avoid, like visits to the nurse, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they're all pretty, in this study, they're all pretty kind of run-of-the-mill things that kids experience. The one weird kind of outlier is the condiments example. But that was an actual issue for this kid because he lived in a residential home setting with 8 other kids, and the home had access to condiments because it's a home full of teenage boys, and the cafeteria had condiments. And this had been like a lifelong problem for this kid, that every mealtime was just a huge problem for him because he wanted all the condiments. Like he would cover his entire plate in every condiment he could get his hands on. And he wasn't allowed to do that because, life, you can't always have all the things that you want.
Yeah. And there may be times when those are not available.
Yeah. And it had just become this like hugely anxiety provoking thing for him of like knowing if he was going to get condiments or if he wasn't, and how much he was going to get and what he was going to get. And certain meals were more problematic than others because there were meals that were supposed to have condiments. Like if there's a hot dog for lunch, well, we're going to let you put something on your hot dog, but you can't cover your whole entire plate in ketchup. Like there has to be limits.
Mm.
I can see how that could like snowball itself into like a really big issue where it gets discussed all day long, right? And there's a lot of decision making that has to happen around it, or problem solving, or
But then we also had other potential participants that we dismissed because when we kind of stepped back and looked at what the problem was that people were coming to us with, we'd say like, okay, this is actually not the thing that we need to make this kid do. Like we had some staff that were really gunning for this one person to be in the project, and she was 22 years old, and she had a lot of anxiety around birthday parties. She hated birthday parties. She was able to verbalize that.
Yeah.
She didn't want to go to birthday parties, and she could tell you the reason why was she hated the happy birthday song. And I was like, I'm with you. It's kind of annoying, right? Especially when you get a lot of people singing like the wrong notes and stuff. And her teachers really wanted her to go to birthday parties because then they got to go too, which is for teachers, like it's a nice little break in your day when there's a birthday party. But really for this kid not a kid, she was 22, it was totally appropriate for her to elect not to go to parties. That's an okay thing. And so that was one situation where we had to tell the staff we can't accept her into this project because this is, yes, there's some anxiety around this, but this is an avoidable thing. Like we don't need to treat the anxiety by forcing her to go to birthday parties. We can just go, okay, cool. If you don't want to go to birthday parties, that's okay. You can just tell us, and then you can maybe write a birthday card for the person and deliver it to them earlier in the day and be polite and say, hey, I can't come to your party. I have something else to do. And we taught some skills around that instead. And that was a win-win for everybody then, except for the teachers that didn't get to go to the party.
All the uneaten cake, and they couldn't get it.
That's really awesome. I'm so glad you shared that anecdote. And just to bring it back around to myself, I really hate calling anyone on the telephone, but there are times, and I do honestly have social anxiety about it, but there are times in which there's no other way to solve the problem than to actually call someone on the phone. So if I had to compare my ketchup issue to my phone call issue, the phone call is the one that should be addressed.
You still hate calling me? We talk a lot.
That could be a fear response, though, either.
1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. No, just kidding.
I mean, we talk every day on the phone.
No, I don't mind talking to you at all.
Yeah. I think talking about the ketchup situation, I feel like you're a lot like Mike in terms of you kind of have gone through many of the steps of graduated exposure for dealing with ketchup, but I still think it does impact your mealtime behavior to some extent. Maybe not significantly, but we should probably pick our dependent variable. We can really test that out. You know, I think because you might need.
Are you just trying to like get the response out of me right now?
No. I'm just saying. I feel like you might be one of those people who like you've gotten used to dealing with ketchup, but it still impacts your life. Like we might need to put a reinforcement plan in place to improve your quality of life at dinners with ketchup.
Right. Well, I mean, since I'm verbal, I'm able to tell you that I still experience some of that same anxiety, just at a covert level, so you can't always see my reaction. But I'm screaming on the inside.
But much like Mike, now the kids make fun of you, and they're like, "Ooh, Mom, I'm going to put ketchup on your food."
Yeah, they do.
And I'm like, Mike, I think it does impact. Just hearing the word ketchup, I think you're going to drop in, conversation skills or whatever we would measure.
I do the same thing
With ketchup.
Yep.
You guys so mean.
Oh, and harassing Diana. I know.
I'm so sorry. I won't do it anymore.
It's fun.
AKA, I still will.
It is fun.
You'll maybe answer the phone and then just say ketchup.
I've got some french fries over here. There's ketchup on them.
You start putting it in like her shampoo bottles.
Oh, yuck. Like that now I'm going to have anxiety if I take a shower. I don't mind ketchup either.
Just ruin everything. Yeah, that's I think a really, really important thing to consider, especially when you are treating anxiety in a nonverbal population or people that aren't really able to give you more information about the problem, is to first take a step back and really think about, is this thing that the person is having anxiety about essential to them functioning in their life? And if it's not, if it's something that is avoidable, then we're much better off teaching them skills, functional skills of how to avoid the thing and how to say like, hey, no, I don't want to go to birthday parties, or hey, I don't like loud noise. Give me some earphones to put on. Like those are acceptable things to do instead of having to deal with whatever is anxiety provoking.
Keira, I think that'd be, maybe more than one exception, but I think one of the exceptions that you brought up in the paper is the idea that, well, which I kind of thought of like, oh, well, why can't we just teach these individuals, like, I don't like the hair dryer. I don't want to go to the nurse. I mean, the nurse, not so great, because you eventually are going to have to see a medical professional in your life. But just use functional communication. That works for everything. And I think you brought up a great point of one of the challenges of the functional communication is when you are competing with the anxiety response. So whether it's behavioral suppression, potentially the freezing up, or they're engaging in other responses, it may be impossible to actually effectively prompt and then teach the functional communication, especially an individual who already has sort of limited verbal behavior. So would you consider that an exception, or more just sort of along the same lines of assessing the utility of treating anxiety?
Yeah. That was actually a consideration with our participant ZAW, who had the loud noise issues. We had identified through functional analysis that there was a particular student that was setting him off. And it was so bad that if this student was anywhere in his vicinity, his go-to was really severe aggression towards staff, and he was hurting people. So with him, we couldn't introduce the thing that was triggering him, because he would go 0 to 60 in a second, and it was dangerous. But with lower intensities of sound, so we didn't use that other student in our anxiety assessment. We used some other neutral sounds. I think we had like a car alarm and a baby crying, and they were both recordings. But we would find that when those were signaled, he would freeze. It was like a deer in the headlights kind of response. And we were trying to teach him to say all done. That was all we wanted for functional communication, was just having him sign all done. But when he was anticipating a loud noise, he would almost go like catatonic and rigid. Like you couldn't even physically prompt him. His face was blank. And that was a precursor to, if this sound happens or if this thing gets any closer, he's going to just snap and somebody's going to get hurt. So we were at this weird point of like, you can't prompt the appropriate response because he is so freaked out right now, he can't even move. But now if we don't get that appropriate response and have him escape that stimulus, it's going to escalate. So that was a really important thing for him to be able to teach that relaxed response, which for him involved moving and breathing and just kind of settling into his chair, and then slowly reintroduce the aversive stimulus and still teach him to be able to control it and be able to say all done. Mm-hmm. So I think those two things really go hand in hand. There should never be one without the other. Mm-hmm. There shouldn't be just teaching kids to tolerate things that they don't like or that they're afraid of and just being like, oh, well, suck it up, got to do it. Or just teaching them to escape it every time. Mm-hmm. There should always be somewhere in between. So I think when you're dealing with anxiety, you have to have both parts of that.
So you had your participants, from the long process. You've done some observations, so you sort of had a sense of these are the observable behaviors we'll be tracking, and they were different. Other than a few, I think, similarities, there's differences between the participants in terms of what were the anxiety provoking or potentially anxiety provoking events. Can you talk a little more about the assessment itself? Because I think we've discussed some specifics, but I don't think we've done like the general procedure.
Mm-hmm. So most of our participants would run their assessments in a research room that they were not in other than for these purposes. So it was a brand new, pretty empty room for them. And the first couple minutes of the session was like a little mini baseline where we were just not engaging with them as kind of like a no interaction condition of an FA. And we were just looking at what are their baseline rates of whatever behaviors we're measuring. And then after the amount of time for that depended on the participant, but it was only a couple minutes. Then we would introduce a signal which told them that the bad thing was about to happen. For most kids, that include both a visual cue and a verbal cue. So we would show them a picture of something and say, in 1 minute, whatever this thing is going to happen. So if it was a loud noise, we'd say, 1 minute, I'm going to play a loud noise. And we'd show them a picture of somebody covering their ears. We would wait 1 minute. The visual signal would be on that whole time during that 1 minute period. And we'd measure behavior during that signaled period. And that's the really important part for anxiety. That's what we're really focused on, is what happens when they're anticipating that bad thing. Then the signal goes off. The bad thing happens for 1 to 2 minutes, depending on what it was. So if it was like a loud noise, we would play a noise, not super loud. It was like a recorded car alarm that would go on and off for a minute. If it was something like going to the nurse's office, that might be 2 minutes just because it took us a little bit of time to walk towards the nurse's office. And then at the end of that aversive event, we would make it very clear that thing is done now. So we'd say, okay, nurse is all done. Have the nurse leave the room. We'd say, okay, the loud noise is all done. We'd turn it off and we'd take the speaker out of the room. And then we would go back to that no interaction sort of mini baseline again. So we're looking at what's happening with behavior now that it's all over. So we have kind of that pre-bad thing baseline and post-bad thing baseline. And then we have that signal and we have the bad things. We kind of have 4 different elements in the test.
And so from that, you would get the patterns of responding to determine, was this a situation in which you saw a change in behavior during the signal as well as when the stimulus was present? You had, I know, one participant in which the signal really seemed to have no change in behavior. It was only in the presence of, I think it was loud noises.
I think that was the hair clipper.
It was the hair clipping.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So for anxiety, what we're looking for is a change from baseline in that signaled period. And that can be either an increase or a decrease. We had participants go both ways. So we had some participants that during that baseline, they're just kind of sitting there at their desk, zoning out and being like, this is weird that this girl has brought me to this empty room. What are we doing? Mm-hmm. And then you say like, hey, I'm going to play a loud noise. And then they're like, oh my God. And they're like doing all kinds of stuff for the next minute. So we call that pattern conditioned activation, when you have not a lot going on and then stimulus comes in and then behavior's all over the place and things are happening. And then we have the aversive event. We're also looking at what's happening then, because that might indicate that we have maybe some escape or avoidance maintained behavior. And then we look at, does that all calm back down once that aversive stimulus is gone? For some kids, we had the opposite. We had conditioned suppression, which means whatever ongoing level of behavior they have kind of stops. They have that deer in the headlights kind of response. So those tended to be kids that were like moving around, doing their thing, kids with kind of higher activity level, like a lot of vocal and motor stereotypy kind of bopping around the room. And then all of a sudden you say like, hey, in 1 minute, this is going to happen. And they just freeze. And they don't do anything for a minute while they're just waiting for the stimulus to happen. So there's those kind of two different presentations of anxiety that we're looking for there. So the important part really is that change during the signal.
And then from that, you were able to determine, all right, we have the pattern, we have the conditioned activation, we have the conditioned suppression, and you would have a treatment in place to respond to their anxiety. Or in the case of the participant with the hair clipping, it was just escape or avoidant behavior. So it
turned out he just was doing whatever he could to get out of haircuts, but he didn't have there was no anxiety about it. We'd say like, hey, in 1 minute, we're going to cut your hair. And he'd be like, okay, good luck. And then he'd just be sitting there staring at us and be like, well, bring it on, what you got? And then as soon as the clippers would come out, he was aggressive and yelling and screaming. But that's just good old escape, maintain, problem behavior. Like there's no anxiety about it. It's not like he's sitting there being like, oh God, when are they going to cut my hair next? It was just like the clippers come out and he's like, no, this is not happening. So he went into a different treatment program. He didn't need the anxiety treatment because he didn't have anxiety.
I'd love to hear you talk more about the relaxation response chain that you taught so many of the participants, because again, it's one of those pieces that I think you read in the article and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's kind of how I think a lot of people deal with anxiety. Oh yeah, it's like a chain. And then you read it again, you're like, hey, that sounds more complicated than I think it would be, because it wasn't as simple as like, here, try relaxing. Let me play some Enya and it's all going to be good. Because we're talking about learners who just sort of describing the process of relaxing may not be a way that they would be able to learn that skill just from sort of like verbal report or modeling of relaxation. So could you describe what the relaxation kind of chain of behavior was, how you prompted it, how it was taught, all that?
Yeah, these participants were all kids that were, I think, I don't really know what level of autism we'd classify them as, but they were on the lower functioning limited verbal end. So just telling them to relax is going to be a lost cause. So we'd set up little picture activity schedules for them, and they all already had familiarity with that in other parts of their programming. And in the beginning, we would walk them through that, and we'd use a combination of modeling and actual physical prompting if they needed it. But I'm trying to think, I think all those guys learned their schedules really quickly because they were really simple responses like taking a deep breath, squeezing a ball, lowering your shoulders, closing your eyes, sitting back in your chair. And we picked things that directly competed with what their behaviors were that they were engaging in when they had anxiety. So if they were talking a lot, or if they were whining, or if they were crying, or they were screaming, we'd pick taking a deep breath because that's incompatible with whining or screaming or perseverating about something. If they were moving their hands around a lot or pacing around the room, we'd have them sit in a chair and squeeze a therapy ball and plant their feet on the ground. So it was a series of incompatible behaviors that are things that we tend to think of as relaxing behaviors. Whether or not they actually have that effect, we don't know because those kids couldn't report that. But I think every one of them included taking deep breaths, which is generally the number one thing that people recommend, right? When you're having any kind of anxiety.
And for all of the participants, that was effective in decreasing those levels of either suppression or activation in the anxiety minute or the signal minute.
The important thing was that we taught those schedules in isolation first. So you don't just bring that in and be like, hey, I'm going to play a loud noise and now do this thing. We would teach them those things in their classroom first until we knew they had it down. They didn't need any more prompting from us. We'd start with really dense reinforcement, and then we'd fade that out until we got to a point where we could hand them the schedule and say, relax, and they could go through and do it themselves without a lot of prompting. And then we'd introduce it back in that context. So it would look exactly like an assessment condition where we'd start with that little mini baseline, and then we'd give them the signal. But as soon as we gave the signal, we'd also give them that little picture activity schedule and prompt them to relax. Mm-hmm. And then if they needed additional prompts to remember to keep doing that, we would keep prompting if needed. And then same thing with when we actually introduced the aversive stimulus, we'd prompt again to relax and engage in that incompatible behavior. And with some of the kids, we took that aversive stimulus and we we shrunk it down and we broke it down into steps. Like with the one kid with the nurse, it would be, okay, you have to take one step towards the nurse's office, engage in this relaxed activity schedule, and then we're done. Then you get to escape it. And then the next day we'd take 2 steps and we'd do the same thing. But for her, escaping the aversive stimulus was contingent on doing that relaxed schedule.
So not too dissimilar than, say, a graduated exposure condition or kind of a progressive relaxation treatment might be for an individual who had a more complex verbal repertoire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sometimes those are just based on approaching, and there's no specific behavior that's trained. So this is, I think, a little bit of a unique take on that, in that we're giving you this specific incompatible behavior to do. We're training it in the context of not that scary thing first, so that we know you know how to do it. Which I actually got from dog training. I got that from Jesus Rosales Ruiz, has a really cool dog training protocol that they call CAT, which I always forget what it stands for. CAT for dogs, but it's basically for dogs that are afraid of strangers or afraid of other dogs. And their whole protocol is basically scared dog sits where it is, scary person walks towards the dog, and the dog barks and like does its thing. And they wait until the dog displays some kind of calm behavior. So they stop barking, or they lay down, or they de-escalate in some way. And then the scary thing goes away. And then the next day, the scary thing comes one step closer. Same thing. They wait until they get calm behavior. Scary thing goes away again. So that was also part of what was kind of going through my brain when we came up with that treatment. I had just seen a really cool talk on that, and I was like, oh, that would work in this context.
Very nice. I think the whole makeup of the study, the treatment, it feels very much in line with what I think many of us think of when we think of anxiety and anxiety treatment, just being applied in a very clever way with individuals who wouldn't be able to engage with sort of the typical treatment package of, oh, tell me, what are your triggers? Let's talk about it. Okay, now we're going to do your... They wouldn't have been able to do that, but just sort of capturing a lot of, I think, those components, and in a way that led to measurable and observable results. So I guess we've gone over both of these studies, and actually I had a lot more questions, but I think that'll make more sense to do in Dissemination Station. All right, so full disclosure here, I mostly have these questions because I always have a lot of things I want to talk about with anxiety, and I sort of just wanted to get your opinion on a few things. So if any of these go beyond your scope of knowledge or the research, you can just say, stop it, Rob, and we'll move on.
I'll just make something up.
Or make something up, and I won't know the difference, yeah. I guess part of me just loves the idea of looking for an observable dependent variable in terms of measuring anxiety, in terms of looking at the effectiveness of anxiety treatment. However, it doesn't seem like that is kind of in the cards for the general population. Is that something that's just sort of like a behavior analyst's anxiety of like, no, I have to see it or it's no good? Or do you see that they're being evaluated? We probably should be looking at more measurable components when we're doing these anxiety treatments and these anxiety assessments, regardless of the individual's verbal repertoire.
Mm-hmm. I think if you ask anybody who experiences anxiety, what does that mean for you? It's not all private events. And typically that's, again, not the thing that people are complaining the most about. Most people, the respondent anxiety, like the stuff you feel, is really uncomfortable. Most people don't like those feelings. But typically when people are complaining about anxiety, it's the effect it's having on their life. In other words, how it's changing their behavior. So it's like, I can't focus and get my work done, or I can't go to sleep, or I'm pacing around, or I'm twirling my hair, or I'm
avoiding all the doctor's appointments.
Yeah. Or like I'm biting my cuticles, or I'm picking my skin, or things like that. So I think that we are missing a really big piece when we only look at the verbal report, or when we only look at the physiological effects of anxiety. And again, that's where that kind of traditional psychology relying on medication, because we're thinking of this as some internal thing, it doesn't solve the problem, because it does maybe change the way you're feeling, which maybe might change some of your outward behavior as well, but likely doesn't, because probably that aversive stimulus is still there and it's still affecting you in some way.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're missing the boat. I think it definitely has its utility too, because sometimes we aren't aware of our own overt behavior. Sometimes we're doing things in situations when we're anxious that we don't even notice. Like I was saying, my tell for when I'm anxious about something is verbal diarrhea. My verbalizations go up, which might not be a bad thing, but it might be a really bad thing. In some situations, it is a really bad thing because I'll start talking too much and say things that I shouldn't be saying. So,
but that on a podcast, that's what makes it great.
Yeah.
Yep.
There you go. I know. But things like, I mean, like in your typical, I think if most people were to actually try and track their own anxiety and do it in sort of a similar way of paying attention to like when there is a stimulus present that is signaling something bad, what do you do? And what are the actual measurable behavioral things that are happening? Like a lot of adults drinking alcohol is a big one. Marijuana,
Mine's eating cookies.
drugs, eating, yeah.
Cookies.
So that's like it's like all the things that we talk about as stress and how that kind of manifests. Those are actually just observable measures of anxiety and things that we could actually be tracking. Jackie could track the number of cookies that she's eating, and that might help her identify. Yeah, you do need a baseline rate of cookies.
One time I ate an entire sleeve of cookies, and then I talked about it for like 3 days. Because I felt so bad that I ate so many cookies.
So you're not anxious about the people giving you cookies? If anyone's wondering that they might scare Jackie if they give her a big tray of cookies,
no, give me all of the cookies.
Happily take it.
She would not be upset.
The person might be upset because they'll be gone in 1 minute.
Well, they gave you the cookies, so they knew what they're getting into.
They're just trying to help you measure your anxiety.
Right? How anxious are you today?
Is it
Half
2
a
cookie day?
1 cookie, half a tin, full tin, 2 tins?
So, Keira, I think one of the issues where I see a lot of anxiety being discussed, and I find it often being less helpful, would be I deal a lot with school refusal behavior. And even in the school refusal literature, they speak about avoidance of school or like avoidance of, social situations, maybe like a bully or getting up in front of the class, rather than anxiety of those situations. However, I don't think it matters how much I use the word avoidance, because typically once that starts rolling, it's the anxiety of school. They have anxiety of school. That's why they don't go to school, because they're so anxious about school. And usually the measurement is, I can't get them out of bed. We're talking about adolescents who I'm guessing their baseline is, I don't want to get out of my bed if I don't have to a lot of the time already. Adolescents in American public schools are forced to get up much earlier than they're physiologically able to get, or, really could, can get up easily. So I'm always struck with like, well, I mean, what do they do on the weekend? Oh, they sleep till 12. I mean, okay, that's not too different than what you're describing about going to school. So do they have anxiety about school, or are they just don't want to get out of bed? So again, that kind of, is this anxiety or is this avoidance? Again, does it matter? Maybe, maybe not. But I'm always sort of looking at ways that we could better measure it, because once it becomes anxiety, it really turns into, there's nothing we can do other than treatment for anxiety. So they're going to have to do some sort of a relaxation treatment, and we don't know how to do that, or they don't want to do that. So there's nothing we can do. And then it's a lot of like removing stimuli that might cause anxiety, which means, you're doing like the shortened school day and less work is presented. And again, not that couldn't be part of an effective treatment, but the concern that, are we jumping to that way too fast in our discussion, or we're basing that treatment on only verbal report?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm hoping that people can use this study as a way to say, hey, look, we actually can define it behaviorally. We can measure it behaviorally. So if we think this is a case of anxiety, let's figure out what is the aversive stimulus, and then let's do a quick test. You can, these conditions, the way we set them up, it doesn't have to be this big thing where you have to have a special research room. You could do that in a kid's home. Like if you have something that you suspect is an aversive stimulus that's anxiety provoking, you can define that for yourself and figure out what the specific behavior is that you're looking at.
All right. So it sounds like when they're not sleeping, they're like, okay, in a minute, gonna go to school. And then
when that, like, if they won't get out of bed, yeah, for sure. Yeah, because that could also be a thing too, where you can set up different conditions of like, okay, well, what if we're signaling something different? Like, hey, school's canceled today. But in 1 minute, we're going to get out of bed and go to the zoo. And like, do you have that behavior anymore, or is something different happening?
Yeah.
Teenagers love the zoo.
No, that's how we discover they're both anxious of the zoo and school. Oh, no.
That's one thing I would get out of bed for quickly if someone told me I was going to the zoo. But I'm much like a teenager in that I don't want to get out of bed in the morning.
Me neither.
That's why I work from home now. I can stay in pajamas all day. I have pants anxiety.
Yeah. In a minute, you got to put on some pants.
Oh God, that would cause all my blood pressure is going up right now.
I don't actually own any pants.
At all?
I don't really anymore.
You mean like button pants?
Button pants. I don't own button pants.
Just elastic waist pants?
Yeah.
Okay.
Those were so early 2000s.
You know
We're not doing them anymore.
I am.
I can't remember the last time I put on button pants.
Overrated.
Oh boy.
So, last question, I think.
Yeah, it's Keira. You mentioned a little, you hope some people use this, but like, what's next for this line of research? Or if you could wave a magic wand and have it be the next wave of research, like what do you think is still out there to see? I mean, it's a new study, so replication, I'm guessing, but
I would love to see just some simple replication first. We had a lot of participants that we ran through this. I've used it in clinical practice and had good results as well, but it's just one study, and there's similar things in the vein of like the Jones and Friman study, but there's nothing really identical to this, so it needs replication. I think extension to more verbal people that can also give us a verbal behavior accompaniment that we can measure along with this, especially because we don't know in our treatment, were they still experiencing respondent anxiety or respondent behavior? Like maybe they were still feeling butterflies in the stomach. Maybe they never felt that to begin with. We have no idea. So it'd be great to have some participants that could actually report on those things as well, just to have another measure of that. The good thing is there is a lot of research on this same kind of treatment with verbal people that have reported that it helps with the sort of respondent end of anxiety as well. So fingers crossed that that's the case for our participants too, but we just don't know. Still a lot of questions.
Still a lot of questions. Well, I would love to use some of the pieces of this protocol in the future. So don't be afraid if you get an email from me with like, here, what about this? Okay, as the signal and okay.
I would love for people to be using it in clinical practice and reaching out if they have questions, because I don't know, I might not have the answers, but I'm interested to see how it works out for people.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, Dr. Keira Moore, thank you so much for being on the show tonight, for talking all about your work and answering all the questions that I had. I had more, but I was getting a look, so I don't want. I've got question anxiety now.
It was my luck, Keira. I'm tired.
Jackie signaled that she was going to be mad about the questions with her facial expression. So thank you so much for being on the show. Where can folks reach out if they do suddenly say, you know what, I'm gonna do replication, or I have an idea for an extension, and they sort of want to maybe pick your brain a little bit about your study and how it might look in different settings or with a different population?
Best place to find me is via my website, which is morebehaviorconsulting.com. And it's Moore, like my last name. And there's a contact me button that works most of the time. And if it doesn't, my email is on there too, which is just Keira at Moore Behavior Consulting, and people can contact me there.
Big thanks to our special guest, Dr. Keira Moore, for coming on the show and talking all about anxiety treatment with us. I don't know if you could hear it in my voice, but this is a topic that I love talking about. So I was very happy to have Keira on, and very glad that she allowed me to ask so many fun questions, and we hope you enjoyed all of those questions too. Before we wrap up the show, I want to make sure that you all get the last secret code word. It is Frida, Frida, whether it's the famous painter or whether it's the name of Dr. Moore's dog, Frida Paulo. Either way you remember it, that is our second secret code word, Frida. And with that, we come to the end of another episode of ABA Inside Track. Thank you so much for listening. We really hope you enjoyed the show. It would mean a lot to us if you would subscribe, maybe rate us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you listen to your podcast. A lot of other ways you can reach out to us as well. You can find us on all the socials as ABA Inside Track. You can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find links to all of the articles we've discussed, a list of all of our old episodes, as well as to purchase CEs. You can find all of our posts on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. And if you want even more ABA Inside Track content, go to patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where for just $5 a month, you can get all of our podcasts a week ahead of time, as well as some bonus episodes, including access to our live recordings, special guest Q&As, and a chance to vote on any of our upcoming events like our book clubs. And speaking of book clubs, if you subscribe at the $10 or up level, you can gain access to our quarterly book clubs, 2+ hours, all on whatever book we happen to be reading at that time, as well as 2 CEs at no additional charge. If you were here for our first book club of the year, or our last book club of 2021, I should say, we read Nudge, the behavioral economics book. And by the time you are listening to this, we'll be getting prepared for our next book club. What's the topic? Only our voters on Patreon will know. I guess you will too by the time this episode gets posted. Again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. We want to thank a few other people. Certainly, we want to thank Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturry for his interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his editing work. And of course, thanks to Jackie and Diana for being my always faithful co-hosts. Speaking of them, we'll all be back next week for another full-length episode of the show, but until then, keep responding. Bye!